I never intended to go into his house that day. It all started with an innocent mistake, an act of neighborly concern. My husband had left early that morning on a business trip, and I was spending another lonely day at home. Around noon, I heard a strange noise coming from my neighbor's house. At first, I thought it was just the plumbing, but when the sound continued and the water poured in a steady stream, I became concerned. Mr. Thomas had lived next door for about 60 years, having recently been widowed. My husband and I had exchanged pleasantries with him over the years, but I wouldn't say we were close. Still, I couldn't shake the thought that something might be wrong. His front door was slightly ajar, which added to my anxiety. I knocked softly and called out, "Mr. Thomas, are you all right?" There was no response. I hesitated, feeling awkward in someone else's house without permission, but the sound of water was getting louder. What if he was unconscious? I stepped inside, my heart pounding. The living room was clean and quiet. Following the noise, I walked over to the bathroom. The door was slightly ajar, just enough for steam to escape into the hallway. "Mr. Thomas?" I called out again, louder already. And then I saw him. He was standing under the shower with his back turned to me. The bathroom mirror, fogged from the steam, reflected enough for me to see without wanting to. My breath caught and I froze, paralyzed by my mistake. Before I could retreat, he turned and saw me in the mirror. His eyes widened in surprise, but instead of anger, there was something calm in his expression. He quickly grabbed a towel and wrapped it around my waist, stepping out of the shower. "I'm so sorry," I stammered, my cheeks flaming. I heard the sound of the water and thought something was wrong. He chuckled softly. "I should have locked the door. You were just being kind." His answer disarmed me. Most people would have been annoyed, but he seemed almost amused. His calmness made me feel even more anxious. "I'll leave," I muttered, stepping back. "I didn't mean to intrude." He said softly, "Wait. Thanks for checking up on me. It's nice to know someone cares." His words didn't leave me long after I got home. I told myself it was just a fleeting moment, a harmless encounter, but deep down I knew something had changed. The days after that moment were marked by curiosity and anxiety. I avoided seeing Mr. Thomas, feeling too awkward to meet his gaze, but I couldn't get his image out of my mind. It wasn't just the way he looked, but his calmness, his kindness. He wasn't angry or uncomfortable, just understanding. His presence never left my mind, and I replayed the scene over and over in my head. One afternoon as I was trimming the bushes in the backyard, his voice startled me. "Looks like you have a green thumb," he said with a smile as he leaned against the fence. My first impulse was to mutter something and back away, but his friendly tone disarmed me. "It's more of a battle than a skill," I replied, guffawing. He grinned. "You're better at it than I am. My wife had a talent for this sort of thing." The expression on his face softened. "I put most of her plants to death. I couldn't take care of them." There was a vulnerability in his voice that made me pause. "I can help if you want," I offered before I could think, and so it began. The days that followed turned into a routine. I'd spend an hour or two in his yard, helping him tend to his sprawling shrubs and neglected flower beds. He would join me as he told stories about his late wife, his years as a teacher, and the trips he planned but never took. His voice drew me in, warm and smooth. It seemed pure at first, an innocent connection between neighbors, but sometimes his gaze lingered on me longer than it should have. I noticed the way his gaze softened when I laughed, the way his hand touched mine when we worked side by side. One afternoon, as we stood admiring the garden, he held out a glass of lemonade to me. Our fingers touched for a moment, and I felt a jolt, as if the air between us had shifted for a moment. "You've done more for this place than I have in years," he said quietly, keeping his eyes on me. "It's nothing," I replied, my voice quieter than I wanted it to be. "It's not nothing," he said, and there was something in his tone that took my breath away. I looked away, trying to laugh. "Maybe you just need help. Or maybe I just need someone to remind me how much of life there is still to live," he said, his voice flat. I didn't know how to react. Part of me wanted to pull away, to remind myself that I was married, but another part of me reached for him, unable to ignore the spark between us. His presence was something I looked forward to, and the line between neighborly concern and something deeper began to blur. The evening when everything changed was quiet, a fine rain tapping on the windows. My husband had called earlier to say his trip would be delayed. I felt the weight of loneliness pressing on my chest. I hadn't planned to go to Mr. Thomas's house that evening, but somehow I found myself at his door, holding a plate of cookies I'd baked. When he opened the door, his smile was warm and his eyes lit up with surprise. "For me?" he asked. "Just thought you might want something sweet," I replied, feeling silly. He invited me inside, and soon we were sitting in his cozy living room, The warmth of the fire contrasted with the cold outside. We talked as we always did, but today was different. There was an intimacy in the air that neither of us recognized. When I set my glass on the coffee table, he reached out to catch it before it tipped him. Our hands collided, and instead of pulling away, we both froze. I lifted my head and his gaze rested on mine, questioning. "You don't have to stay if you're uncomfortable," he said quietly. "I'm not uncomfortable," I whispered, and the words came out on their own before I could stop them. He leaned closer, and I didn't pull away. The space between us dissolved, and when his lips met mine, it was gentle at first, almost tentative, but it quickly became deeper, brought on by months of unspoken longing. I knew it was wrong, all my inside screaming that it shouldn't be, but in that moment everything else seemed unimportant, just the way his hands held me, the way his touch made me feel wanted, alive. Time was blurring. The rain outside intensified, but all was quiet inside, except for our breathing and the quiet crackling of the fire. He paused, glancing at me, giving me a chance to stop, but I didn't. When it was over, we sat in silence, feeling the weight of what had just happened. He reached for my hand and squeezed it gently. "I never meant to make things difficult for you," he said quietly. I didn't know what to say back. My mind was a whirlwind of guilt and desire. I should have felt shame, and part of me did, but another part of me felt liberated, like I'd broken out of a cage I didn't even know I had. That night I stayed out longer than I should have and only left when the rain stopped. I walked home with a heavy heart, my mind reeling with questions about what I had done and why. Despite everything, I wanted to do it again. The days that followed were a torrent of guilt and longing. Every glance at my husband felt like a betrayal. Every moment alone with myself brought back memories of that night. I told myself it was a mistake, that it would never happen again, but the pain in my chest told me otherwise. At first, Mr. Thomas and I avoided each other, pretending nothing had happened, but the silence between us was unbearable. My heart sank whenever I caught a glimpse of him through the window, and I could tell he felt it too. One evening I found myself at the fence, and he was already there waiting for me. "I've been thinking about us," he said quietly. "I don't want to hurt you or your life." "I don't want to hurt you either," I replied, though my voice shook. The truth was that I didn't know what I wanted. I wanted to keep my marriage, my life the way it was, but I also couldn't deny that I was drawn to Mr. Thomas. He sighed. "I spent so many years alone, convincing myself I didn't need anyone. But then you came along and I stopped." He shook his head. "I didn't expect that." Tears came to my eyes. "It's not just you. I'm the one who let it happen." "You don't need to blame yourself," he interrupted gently. His words should have brought relief, but they only made the pain worse. "So what are we going to do?" He hesitated, then took my hand. "We're going to move on with our lives. We'll forget this happened." But forgetting wasn't easy. The tension between us never eased, even when we tried to keep our distance. Every chance encounter, every glance we exchanged reopened the wound. My husband, oblivious to what was going on inside me, continued with his usual lifestyle, leaving me even more alone than before. One evening, my husband asked me why I seemed detached. His question caught me off guard, and for a moment I wondered if I should tell him everything. But the fear of losing everything stopped me. Instead, I lied, saying I was just tired. He accepted my answer without further ado, and that lie stayed with me. Mr. Thomas, true to his word, began to drift away. He stopped coming to the fence. He stopped inviting me to visit. It hurt more than I expected, but I told myself it was for the best. I focused on my marriage, trying to rebuild what I had allowed to be destroyed. But every once in a while, I would catch a glimpse of him in the yard, and my heart would start to ache again. Memories of that night we shared never left me. It lingered in the quiet moments in between my thoughts. In the end, there was no closure, no tidy resolution, just a quiet recognition that some choices leave scars and some connections, however fleeting, change you forever. Life went on, but I knew I would always carry a piece of him inside me.